On the morning of August 25, 2026, in a hospital room in Nashville, Tennessee, the woman the whole world called the Queen of Country took her final breath. She was surrounded by people who loved her. Outside, the city had no idea. The traffic moved. The coffee shops opened. Nobody knew that in a matter of hours, flags across an entire nation would be lowered, that strangers on every continent would cry over a woman they had never met, and that a 5-foot-tall girl who once wore a dress made from rags would leave behind one of the greatest American stories ever lived. This is that story. Not just the ending. All of it. From a one-room cabin with no running water, to sold-out stadiums, to a theme park built on a promise, to a marriage so private most people never even saw a photograph of her husband's face. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand why so many people are calling her passing the end of an era. And you will understand why, even now, somewhere, a radio is playing one of her songs, and someone is smiling through tears. Let's go back. Not to the hospital. Not to the headlines. Let's go back to where it all began, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains of East Tennessee, in a place so small it barely had a name. It was January of 1946. The world outside was rebuilding after war. But in the hills near a town called Sevierville, none of that mattered much. What mattered was survival. In a 2-room cabin with no electricity and no running water, a woman named Avi Lee gave birth to her 4th child. A baby girl. The family didn't have money for a doctor. The bill for delivering her into the world was paid with a sack of cornmeal, because that was all her father had to give. They named her Dolly Rebecca Parton. She was born into a family that would eventually grow to 12 children, all raised under one tin roof, all sharing beds, all sharing chores, all sharing hunger some winters. Her father worked the land with his hands, farming tobacco and whatever else the rocky soil would allow. Her mother sang. All day, every day she sang. Hymns while she cooked. Ballads while she rocked babies to sleep. Old mountain songs passed down through generations. Songs about love and loss and faith. Songs that had been sung by her people for over 100 years in those same hills. And little Dolly listened. She has said many times since that she doesn't remember learning to sing, because as far as she was concerned, she'd always known how, the same way she'd always known how to breathe. There is a story, one that has become almost legend, about a coat her mother made her. The family had no money for new clothes, so when little Dolly needed a winter coat, her mother sewed one together from a box of fabric scraps that people from the church had donated. Different colors, different patches, stitched into something warm enough to survive a mountain winter. Dolly loved that coat. To her, it was beautiful. But when she wore it to school, the other children laughed at her. They called her poor. They made her cry. And that day planted something in her, a seed that would grow for the rest of her life, a determination that one day, the world would not laugh at her anymore. It would sing along with her instead. Poverty in those mountains wasn't the kind you read about in books. It was real. It was cold nights with too many blankets missing. It was going without shoes some summers to save the ones you had for winter. It was watching your mother stretch a single chicken to feed 14 people. But what that family lacked in money, they made up for in something you cannot buy. Music, faith, and a stubborn mountain-bred kind of hope that refused to die no matter how hard life pressed down on it. The cabin itself sat tucked into a hollow along a river, the kind of place where the sun took its time coming over the ridge each morning, where the sound of water running over stones was as constant as breathing. There was no privacy in a house that small with that many children. Beds were shared 3 and 4 to a mattress. Meals were whatever the garden gave that season, whatever could be canned, whatever could be caught or grown or bartered for. And yet, if you ask anyone who has studied her life closely, or if you listen to the way she herself described those years, you will notice something strange. She almost never described her childhood as sad. Hard, yes. Poor, absolutely. But sad, rarely. Because in that hollow, surrounded by more brothers and sisters than most people can even name, there was noise, there was laughter, there was music spilling out of every corner of that cabin at almost every hour of the day. Poverty took a lot from that family. It never once managed to take the music. By the time she was 6 years old, Dolly had already built her first guitar, if you could call it that. She took a mandolin that had 2 broken strings and rest-rung it with rubber bands and wire from an old screen door, just so she could make music with something, anything. Her uncle, a man named Bill Owens, saw something in her early. He recognized that the little girl singing in that cabin had a voice that didn't belong to a child. It belonged to somebody older, somebody who had already lived 100 lives of heartbreak, even though she'd barely lived one of her own. By the time she was 10, he was taking her to perform on local radio and television programs in Knoxville. A tiny girl with a big voice, standing in front of a microphone, singing her heart out to strangers who had no idea they were watching the beginning of a legend. At 13 years old, something happened that would change the direction of her entire life. She got the chance to record a song and to perform at the Grand Ole Opry, the most sacred stage in all of country music, the place every singer in Nashville dreamed of standing on. Most performers waited their whole careers for an invitation like that. Dolly got hers as a teenager. She sang, the crowd roared, and legend has it that a rising star named Johnny Cash himself encouraged her afterward, telling her to keep going, that she had something special. Whether every detail of that story has been polished by time, one thing is certain. From that moment, this 13-year-old girl from a cabin with no running water knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted Nashville. She wanted the world. But dreams do not pay rent, and dreams do not put food on a table for 12 children. She stayed in East Tennessee finishing school, singing when she could, watching, waiting, planning. She has said that she used to sit on the porch of that little house and imagine her future so vividly it felt more real than the mountains around her. She would tell her family, tell her friends, tell anyone who would listen, that one day she was going to be a star. Most people who say that never become one. She became one anyway. The day after she graduated high school in 1964, she did something that most 18-year-old girls from her world simply did not do. She packed a bag, and she got on a bus to Nashville. Alone. No job waiting. No manager. No guarantee of anything except her own voice and her own nerve. The story goes that on that very first day in the city, she went straight to a laundromat to wash the one good outfit she owned, because she wanted to look her best walking into meetings with record labels. That is the kind of grit this woman was built from, right from day one. Nashville in the 1960s was not an easy town for a poor girl from the mountains, especially not one who looked the way she chose to look. She loved big hair, bright makeup, tight clothes, sparkle, rhinestones, anything that shined. She has said her look was inspired by a certain kind of woman from her childhood, a woman in town the other kids used to gossip about, a woman Dolly always thought was the most glamorous person she had ever seen. People in the music industry, at first, didn't quite know what to make of her. She didn't look like the polished country singers of the era. She looked like herself, exaggerated, loud, unapologetic. It would take years for the industry to understand that underneath all that shine was one of the sharpest songwriting minds Nashville would ever produce. She struggled at first. She worked odd jobs. She wrote songs and tried to sell them to anyone who would listen. She got small opportunities here and there, a few minor chart appearances, but nothing that felt like the destiny she had promised herself on that porch back home. Then, in 1967, everything shifted. A country star named Porter Wagoner, who had one of the most popular syndicated television shows in the entire genre, was looking for a new girl singer to join his act after his previous partner left. Someone suggested Dolly Parton. Porter wasn't sure at first. Her voice, when he finally heard it, changed his mind immediately. She joined the Porter Wagoner show, and almost overnight, millions of households across America began seeing her face and hearing her voice every single week. It should have been the dream come true. In some ways it was. But there was a problem baked into the arrangement from the very beginning. Porter Wagoner was the star. Dolly Parton was, in the eyes of the audience and the industry, his sidekick, his discovery, his girl singer. And Dolly Parton did not intend to spend the rest of her life being anybody's sidekick. For 7 years, she stayed on that show, and their partnership produced hit after hit, duets that country radio adored, a chemistry between the two of them that audiences couldn't get enough of. Porter Wagoner taught her things about the business that she would carry with her for the rest of her career, how to work a stage, how to work a camera, how to turn a television audience into something that felt intimate even through a screen. In many ways, he gave her the platform that took her from a regional curiosity to a household name. She never denied that debt, not even decades later, not even after everything that happened between them. But behind the scenes, tension was building. Dolly wanted to grow. She wanted to write her own songs, chart her own path, step fully into the spotlight rather than share it in someone else's shadow. Porter, understandably from his own point of view, did not want to lose the woman who would become the biggest asset of his career. Their disagreements grew sharper. The friendship that had once felt like family began to fracture under the weight of ambition on one side and control on the other. In 1974, Dolly made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She told Porter she was leaving. He fought her on it hard. Their arguments, by most accounts, grew painful and personal. And rather than scream, rather than fight fire with fire, Dolly Parton did something that only a truly gifted songwriter could do. She went home, sat down, and wrote him a song instead. A song that thanked him for everything he had given her, that told him she would always love him even as she walked away to build a life of her own. That song became one of the most iconic pieces of American music ever written. Decades later, another singer would record her own version of it and turn it into a global phenomenon, introducing an entirely new generation to a melody Dolly wrote in a single afternoon out of heartbreak and gratitude. That later version, recorded for a Hollywood film in the early 1990s, became one of the best-selling singles in the history of the music industry. A version so powerful it made its way into weddings and funerals alike, into movies, into karaoke bars, into the hearts of people who had no idea it began its life as a quiet, tearful goodbye from one Tennessee performer to another. Dolly herself has said, many times, that when she first heard that new version on the radio, she had to pull her car over, because she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She said it felt like hearing her own heartbreak sung back to her by an angel. The royalties from that single recording alone would go on to change her financial life forever, funding investments that helped build the very theme park that would one day carry her name across the hills where she grew up. Two songwriters, one born from a painful goodbye in a Nashville office, changed the course of music history forever. That same era of her life produced another song that would become just as legendary, inspired by something far more personal and far more painful than a business breakup. There was a woman, a bank teller, who Dolly became convinced was paying a little too much attention to her husband. Rather than confront her, rather than let jealousy eat away at her, Dolly turned that fear into art. She wrote a haunting, desperate plea of a song, begging another woman not to take the man she loved. The song became one of the most covered, most sampled, most beloved pieces of music in the history of the genre, a song so powerful that even people who have never listened to a single other country song in their life know exactly how it goes the second those opening guitar notes begin. With Porter Wagoner behind her, Dolly Parton was finally free to become fully herself. And what came next was one of the most remarkable creative and business runs in American entertainment history. Through the mid to late 1970s, she released album after album, wrote hit after hit, and slowly began to do something almost no one from her genre had managed before. She crossed over. Pop radio started playing her. Audiences who had never listened to a note of country music in their lives were suddenly humming her songs. She had built an empire out of heartbreak, hard work, and a voice that refused to be ignored. By the start of the 1980s, Dolly Parton wasn't just a country star anymore. She was a full-blown American icon. She set her sights on Hollywood, and in 1980 she starred in a movie about three overworked, underappreciated office women who turned the tables on their controlling, condescending boss. The film became a massive hit, and the theme song she wrote for it, tapping out the rhythm on her own fingernails because she loved the sound they made, became an anthem for working women everywhere. It shot to the very top of the charts, earned her an Academy Award nomination, and cemented something the world was only beginning to fully grasp. This woman was not just a singer. She was a storyteller, a businesswoman, an advocate, and one of the funniest, sharpest minds in the entertainment industry. On that film set, she formed friendships with her two co-stars that would last for the rest of her life, a bond between three very different women who somehow understood each other completely. Decades later, when the world lost her, those same friends would be among the first to step forward, heartbroken, to tell the world what she had meant to them, not as a legend, but as a friend who called to check in, who showed up, who never once let fame change the way she loved people. Dolly could have taken all that success and simply enjoyed it. Instead, she did something almost nobody expected. She took her fortune and poured it back into the mountains that raised her. In 1986, she partnered to transform a small amusement park near her hometown into what would become Dollywood, a theme park built not just for tourists, but as an economic engine for the region of East Tennessee that had once been so poor it paid for her birth in cornmeal. Dollywood created thousands of jobs. It gave her community something it had never had before, a reason for the world to come to them instead of the other way around. She never forgot where she came from. If anything, the more famous she became, the harder she worked to make sure her home never felt forgotten. But the achievement that many people, including Dolly herself, considered the most important thing she ever did had nothing to do with music or movies or theme parks at all. In 1995, thinking of her own father, a man who never learned to read or write and carried the shame of that his entire life, She started a program to mail free books to children every single month from the time they are born until they start school. What began as a small local effort in her home county grew, book by book, year by year, into a global movement. Eventually, that program was mailing well over 2 million free books every single month to children in multiple countries around the world. Not albums, not awards, books, placed into the hands of children who might never have owned one otherwise. She often said that if she was remembered for only one thing after she was gone, she hoped it would be that. Her generosity did not stop with books. Time and again throughout her life, she showed up quietly when the world needed help, often without asking for credit, sometimes without anyone finding out until much later. When wildfires tore through the mountains near her hometown in 2016, destroying homes and taking lives, she set up a fund that gave displaced families $1,000 a month for months on end, just to help them get back on their feet. When the world was gripped by a global pandemic in 2020, she made a substantial donation toward vaccine research at a major medical center, a contribution that some researchers later credited with helping speed along the very science that eventually helped bring the crisis under control. When asked why she did things like that, she rarely gave a grand speech about it. She usually just said that if you've got it, you're supposed to share it, that she remembered too well what it felt like to have nothing, and she wasn't about to forget that just because her circumstances changed. And through all of it, the fame, the fortune, the movies, the awards, there was one part of her life she guarded more fiercely than anything else. Her marriage. Back before any of the fame had happened, on her very first day in Nashville, at that laundromat where she went to wash her one good outfit, she met a young man named Carl Dean. He wasn't in the music business. He ran an asphalt paving company. He had no interest in the spotlight, no desire to walk red carpets, no need to be seen. And somehow, that was exactly what made their relationship work for close to 60 years. They married in 1966, quietly, in a small ceremony her own mother wasn't even able to attend. From that day forward, Carl Dean stayed almost entirely out of public view. He rarely gave interviews. He rarely appeared in photographs. Dolly Parton, one of the most photographed women on the planet, protected her husband's privacy like it was the most precious thing she owned, because to her, it was. She used to joke that people didn't believe he was real, that some fans thought she'd invented him for a song. But he was real, and by every account she ever gave, he was the great love of her life. Through the decades, through fame that would have crushed most marriages, through decades of her traveling the world while he stayed home in Tennessee, they made it work on their own terms, refusing to let anyone else define what their love was supposed to look like. The years kept moving. Dolly kept reinventing herself again and again, in ways that should have been impossible for someone who had already achieved so much. She released acclaimed bluegrass albums that returned her to the sound of those Smoky Mountain hills where she was born. She wrote musicals. She published books. She built and rebuilt her business empire. In 2022, after initially turning down the honor because she didn't feel she had earned a place among the rock legends who inspired her, she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a moment that brought the industry to its feet, recognizing not just a country star, but one of the most influential songwriters America had ever produced in any genre. Then, in March of 2025, the private world she had spent nearly 60 years protecting was shaken to its core. Carl Dean, her husband, the quiet man from the paving company who had stood beside her since before any of the world knew her name, passed away at the age of 82. Dolly Parton, a woman who had spent her entire public life smiling through hardship, singing through heartbreak, turning pain into art, went quiet for a while. When she did speak, she released a song dedicated entirely to him, a tribute to 60 years of a love story most of the world had only ever glimpsed in fragments. She said publicly that great love stories never really end. They simply live on, in memory, and in song. But the grief took something out of her that even her closest fans couldn't fully see at first. In the months that followed Carl's death, she began speaking more openly about health struggles, admitting she had let herself become worn down, worn out, run ragged from months and months of caring for him while he was sick, and then from the crushing weight of losing him. She postponed a planned residency in Las Vegas. She spoke about ongoing issues, kidney problems, an immune system that had gotten, in her own words, all out of whack. Fans worried. She reassured them publicly, with the same humor she'd used her entire life to soften hard truths, telling the world she wasn't dead yet, that she was healing, that she still had music left in her. Through 2026, she kept showing up when she could. She appeared at Dollywood to kick off the season, thinner than fans remembered, but still smiling, still sharp, still cracking jokes about rock quarries and kidney stones in that unmistakable voice. She talked about grief honestly, about how it can hollow a person out physically as much as emotionally, about how losing Carl had changed something fundamental in her body as much as her heart. Those who loved her held onto every public appearance a little tighter than before, sensing, perhaps, that time was becoming precious in a way it hadn't felt before. And then, in the final week of her life, everything moved quickly. She was admitted to a hospital in Nashville with complications tied to kidney and immune issues that had plagued her for months. Doctors worked to stabilize her. Family gathered close. And somewhere during those final days, the truth that had been quietly building for over a year finally revealed itself in full. She had been fighting cancer. A brief, brutal battle that she had chosen, in her own words and on her own terms, to keep almost entirely private, the same way she had protected her marriage for 60 years. She did not want pity. She did not want the story of her final chapter to be about suffering. She wanted, until the very end, to be remembered for the light, not the shadow. On the afternoon of August 25, 2026, at the Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center in Nashville, surrounded by the people she loved most, Dolly Rebecca Parton died peacefully. She was 80 years old. The news broke first in a video posted by her nephew, a man who had spent years as part of her own security team, standing in for a family too heartbroken in that first moment to speak publicly themselves. Then came the official statement, gentle and poetic, the kind of words that could only have come from people who had spent a lifetime loving her. They describe her life as a rhinestone life, one that shone bright enough for the entire world to see. They said she would forever stand as an inspiration, not only through her music and her songwriting, but through her wit, her warmth, and a kindness that made millions of strangers feel like family. They said her legacy was one of love, compassion, and resilience. And in keeping with the same privacy she had guarded her entire life, the family said her funeral would be small, intimate, just the people who actually knew her, away from the cameras that had followed her for 6 decades. Within minutes of the announcement, the tributes began, and they did not stop. They came from every corner of the world, from presidents and politicians, from country legends who had grown up idolizing her, from pop stars who had never met her but had grown up singing her songs in their bedrooms, from actors, from comedians, from complete strangers who simply wanted the world to know how much she had meant to them. Flags across the United States were ordered lowered to half-staff for an entire week in her honor. A tribute usually reserved for heads of state and fallen soldiers, now given to a girl who once wore a coat made of rags. Broadway shows paused mid-performance so casts could honor her before the curtain rose. Radio stations across the country played nothing but her music for hours. Communities that had never once met her gathered in parks and town squares just to sing her songs together, strangers standing shoulder to shoulder, crying and laughing at the same time, because that was always the strange magic of Dolly Parton. She made you feel like you knew her personally, even if you'd never once shaken her hand. Fellow musicians who had shared stages with her described a woman whose kindness never had an off switch, who remembered the names of stagehands and bus drivers just as easily as she remembered the names of fellow superstars, who once, according to a story that spread widely in the hours after her death, gifted a handmade rhinestone guitar to a young performer she had never met in person, simply because she had heard the young woman had been fighting for a cause Dolly believed in. That was who she was. Not a legend who occasionally reached down to touch ordinary lives, but a woman who never once stopped thinking of herself as one of the ordinary people, no matter how extraordinary her life became. Younger generations of artists, people who grew up decades after her biggest hits first climbed the charts, spoke about her the way you might speak about a grandmother who happened to change the world. Singers from country, from pop, from genres that barely existed when she started her career, all described the same thing in different words. That she had been kind to them when she didn't have to be. That she had gone out of her way to lift up other women in an industry that had not always made room for them. That she carried herself like royalty and treated everyone else like family, all at the same time, a balancing act that almost nobody else in entertainment has ever managed to pull off for as long as she did. Actors she had worked with decades earlier described a woman who called on birthdays, who sent handwritten notes, who never let success change the fundamental decency she had carried with her since that cabin in the mountains. Politicians from opposing sides of nearly every issue found, in the hours after her death, one of the only things they could agree on, that the loss of Dolly Parton was a loss for the entire country, not just for one side of it or one kind of person. When people try to explain why her death hit so many millions of people so hard, despite the fact that most of them had never met her, the answer usually comes back to the same thing. She never pretended to be anyone she wasn't. In an industry built on image and reinvention, in a culture that often rewards distance and mystery, Dolly Parton spent 60 years being loudly, unapologetically, entirely herself, rhinestones and all, and somehow that honesty made an entire planet feel like it had lost a family member rather than a celebrity. Think about the scale of the life this one woman lived. Born in a cabin with no electricity, delivered for the price of a bag of cornmeal, one of 12 children in a family that sometimes didn't know where the next meal was coming from. And from that beginning, she built a musical catalog that will be sung for generations, wrote songs that other artists would turn into some of the biggest hits in the history of recorded music, starred in beloved films, built a theme park that transformed the economy of the region that raised her, and created a charity that placed hundreds of millions of free books into the hands of children who might otherwise never have owned one. She did all of that while protecting a 60-year marriage from the glare of the very fame that made her one of the most recognized faces on the planet. And she did all of that while never once forgetting the little girl in the coat of many colors, laughed at by classmates, who promised herself the world would one day sing along instead. That promise, made by a barefoot child on a porch in the Smoky Mountains more than 70 years ago, came true beyond anything even she could have imagined. And now, the woman who kept that promise is gone. But the songs are not gone. The books mailed to children every single month are not gone. The theme park giving thousands of families a living are not gone. The story of a girl who turned rags into rhinestones, who turned heartbreak into some of the most beloved music in American history, who turned a fortune into kindness instead of keeping it locked away, that story is not gone either. Somewhere tonight, a radio is playing one of her songs. Somewhere tonight, a child is falling asleep holding a free book that arrived in the mail because a poor mountain girl who grew up to be a legend never forgot what it felt like not to have one. Somewhere tonight, someone who is grieving a love of their own is finding a strange kind of comfort in a song Dolly Parton wrote decades ago about loving someone enough to let them go. She always said, in her own way, that as long as people keep singing her songs, she'll never really be gone. Maybe that's true. Maybe legends like her don't actually die the way the rest of us do. Maybe they just step off the stage for the last time, into the wings, into memory, into every radio and every record and every child's bedtime story from here to the end of time. Rest now. Dolly. The coat of many colors you wore as a little girl, the one the other children laughed at, is safe now, folded away in the history of American music, right alongside every rhinestone, every guitar string, every song written from a broken heart that turned out to heal millions of other broken hearts along the way. 80 years, lived louder, brighter, and kinder than almost anyone in living memory. A rhinestone life, exactly as her family said, that shone bright enough for the entire world to see, right up until the very last note.